the talk is based on, the book is called Crimes of Dissent, and that might sound like an interesting, kind of bizarre title, and that's really what I want to focus on today. For those unfamiliar, you might otherwise know Crimes of Dissent as civil disobedience, as passive resistance, nonviolent direct action, things of that nature. But I'm going to kind of explain why I focus on Crimes of Dissent. So now I'd be literally preaching to the choir here if I stood up here and informed you of the shocking news that with our history of the House Committee of Un-American Activities and COINTELPRO and the USA Patriot Act and the NSA Domestic Spying Program, I'd be preaching to the choir if I told you the shocking news that dissent in America has a long history of criminalization, right? I don't think that's anything shocking for us. I think we know this quite too well, and for years many of us have been trying to roll back some of these limits on our civil liberties, and we've been working tirelessly to, in essence, decriminalize dissent here in America by getting our representatives to repeal the most offensive sections of the Patriot Act, by respecting our privacy and other civil liberties. But my intention in naming the book Crimes of Dissent was not to point out the obvious, nor to introduce an opening salvo that pleads for a decriminalization of dissent. My intention was quite the opposite. My book and my book's title marks a conscious and deliberate effort on my part to forever link the words crime and dissent. I think it's important that we recognize that dissent has a long history of criminalization. I think it's important for us to recognize that that which is criminal has always been political. Of course, that which is political has almost always been criminal is a topic for another discussion, but that's neither here nor there. So in titling the book Crimes of Dissent, I've had two goals. One is to label everyday crime as dissent, right? Street crime, white-collar crime, and I'll explain that kind of controversial notion in a second. But more importantly, my second goal is to forever label political dissent as crime. So let's pick those two things apart. Let's start by talking about crime as dissent, right? So let me say a few brief words about the controversial notion that crime can be considered an expression of dissent. In 1903, in an important lecture delivered at the Sorbonne, Emile Durkheim, who's considered the father of sociology and, of course, of criminology, actually and Emile Durkheim is no progressive by any stretch of the imagination. He defines society in very conservative terms. Yet, in this speech, he actually referred to those who openly challenged legal boundaries as, quote, the great moral innovators, end quote. Right? Of course, he then went on to refer to social dissenters as persons who were, quote unquote, morally incomplete. So you have to kind of pick and choose which quotes you want to emphasize. But what's important about that speech was that Durkheim conceded that disobedience is an essential element to the overall health of society. Indeed, Durkheim argued that crime, disobedience, dissent is not pathological to society, but is an integral part of all healthy societies, right? In this speech, he argued the following, quote, "Was not Christ such a deviant, as well as Socrates? And is it not thus with all historical figures whose names we associate with the great moral revolutions through which humanity has passed? Had their feelings of respect for the moral rules characteristic of their day been too lively, they would not have undertaken to alter them. To dare to shake off the yoke of traditional discipline, one should not feel authority too strongly. Nothing could be clearer." End quote. So while Durkheim is most frequently credited with having argued about the strength of the moral code and the respect for the moral code, he was also persuasive in highlighting the relativity of morality itself. Nevertheless, the point should not be oversold. Durkheim was clear to say that there are two very different feelings that one could have. One is the need to substitute a new regulation for the old one. The second feeling is impatience with all rules and the abhorrence with all discipline, right? When we talk about crimes of dissent, we're not talking about a disrespect for all rules and a disrespect for all authority, but we're talking about not holding the law in such high esteem that we become automatons. Returning to this idea of crime as dissent then, many leftist criminological theories have explored the possibility that crime can serve as an expression of dissent. Radical theories argue that crime results from class struggle and from the conditions of inequality. Therefore, crime, according to radical theories, Marxist and other leftist theories, crime is ultimately a reaction or a protest, if you will, against class-based social conditions. Although Marx and Engels dismissed the notion of a revolutionary criminal class, right, other writers taking up the new left have suggested that crime and social conflict, urban riots, street crime, and the like, expose cracks in the foundation of society, right? Thus, banditry, right, reveals a source for potential change. White-collar crime exposes the excesses of capitalism. Even shoplifting and other forms of theft can be thought of as a form of property or income redistribution, right? The point then is that crime and conflict expose flaws in the system and should become fodder for progressive change. Ironically, it's a point that seems to be lost on our current administration. While we've seen the excesses of capitalism and the crimes of previous administrations, there's a reluctance to allow the crimes of the past, again, to prove to be a progressive or revolutionary force, right? Well, I don't want to emphasize the fact too much because there's certainly a paradox arguing that things like rape, robbery, burglary, muggings, and so forth are somehow progressive. Of course, the paradox is that typically the victims of street crimes are the people who could most benefit from some kind of revolutionary change, right? The point, though, is to begin to see how breaking from the rules and from the status quo can spark a seed of the imagination for revolutionary change or for progressive change. So that's talking about crime as dissent. Now let's look more at the important question, which is dissent as crime, right? What I refer to as crimes of dissent, these are strategies through which political resistance can manifest. Collectively, the crimes are open challenges to laws, and by open I mean public, right? Open challenges to the laws and practices of the prevailing climate. The acts are deliberately staged to trigger a response from government and to create access to a public forum where laws can be challenged, right? And because these challenges to the law are launched as a means of exposing injustices, those who engage in these behaviors often defend their actions as being, quote, crime as virtue, end quote. And so we can argue that crimes of dissent are indeed the most pure forms of criminal behavior, right? They're pure because guilt or innocence is never in question. The motive is always deliberately known. The offender, if you will, seeks out an arrest. And the offender, of course, wants to be punished in order to martyr him or herself. And so the term crime as virtue and pure crime actually dates back to Sophocles' play Antigone, where when Antigone was to be punished for her act of dissent, she said, if I have to die for this pure crime, then I am content, right? Throughout history, there have been many pure criminals or criminals of dissent. The Greek philosopher Socrates is celebrated as one such individual. In 399 BC, he was convicted of what can only be considered a pure crime, namely expressing beliefs not recognized by the state, right? When Socrates was punished, he said, quote,